Good evening, folks. Tonight on the Daily Report and on Insight Tonight, we want to look at the subject matter of food security, but through the lens of sustainable and climate-resilient food systems. I know it's quite a mouthful, it's a big topic, but I bet you, good people, it's something that affects you and I. It affects the plate of food right in front of you right about now. We all know climate change is here to stay. The effects of it are already being felt from all corners of this universe. But what is increasingly apparent is that a lot of us are not adapting quickly enough, or we don't even have the knowledge to adapt to be able to live in this day and age where climate change is the rule of the game. And some of the people that are most vulnerable are the people in the food system sector, if I should call it that. And tonight we are joined by a gentleman who actually is well versed in this. He used to serve as the Minister for Agriculture, Livestock Development, the Blue Economy and Fisheries for the County Government of Mombasa. Today, he serves as a chief strategist at Kaya Advisory, and he's a global speaker, an African speaker, an influencer, and somebody who's well versed and absolutely plugged into the subject matter. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I introduce to you Mr. Tendai Leo Mtana, who's joining us from Kigali, Rwanda, where he's just been presiding over, participating in a conference on this very subject. Karibu sana, sir. Karibu.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you. Thank you. Now, just straight into the subject matter. I want you to paint the picture for us, for our viewers who are joining us from wherever it is that they're joining us from. I mean, climate change is something a lot of people still consider to be a buzzword that they don't quite understand. Would you care, in as brief a moment as you can, to connect climate change to food security in a nutshell, if you may?
Thanks. I think the subject of climate change has been framed primarily, in my opinion, and what's happening today and what has been going on over the last 3 days is an effort by an African people, whether they be heads of state, former heads of state, citizens, corporate entities that are primarily involved in the food value chain. And essentially, the whole conversation around climate and food is tied to productivity and the subject that with the temperature change, with the shift in weather patterns, and primarily based on the assumption that Africa is primarily still relying on climate-fed agriculture, which affects livestock and temperatures in the ocean as well. The idea of food systems is actually affecting the conversation around climate. So that's essentially the simplest way to put it. We primarily are a climate-fed food production ecosystem.
Right. Thank you for that. And now there's this other concept that people are still somewhat grappling with, which is the subject of sustainable and climate resilient food systems. Since, like you said in your very good introduction, is that the way we do agriculture, the way we grow our food is primarily driven by, the climate. We rely on rainfall and those rainfall patterns. Can you help us understand exactly what a sustainable and climate resilient food system looks like, and why indeed we need to be resilient in the first place?
Well, I think we would have to take a step back, and it's part of the debate, and an animated one that has been going on here in Kigali. I think it is a bit presumptuous to think that the communities on the African continent haven't been resilient. I think if there's any space across the world that develops and that demonstrates resilience, it's the African continent. And what I mean by that is, let's not forget what we call food systems now are an import. And primarily an import where some of the graphs that have been presented by some of the academic here in Kigali is that we are relying a lot on importation of what we consume. And so some of the trends that have been analyzed is what are we eating, where is it being grown, what is impacting its logistics and distribution, and ultimately what we've begun to see is that there is a need to actually examine the frame, look at the data, understand the biases that are within the data, and also then begin to ask ourselves, where are we growing and what is it that we're actually growing in an effort to determine resilience. I think Africans are generally resilient, and I think with the, especially with the indigenous food systems that we've had, we may actually be looking at an opportunity to actually go backwards in order to leapfrog ahead of the curve to ensure that we're resilient. And so it's a framing issue. And I think that's what's come out of this exercise. If we frame it right, then one of the things that was clearly said and articulated in today's session is we need to take ownership of how we actually craft what we mean by resilient. Unfortunately, a lot of what we're discussing is primarily led by a philanthropist and a development partner approach. Our state actors, our governments are not at the forefront of this conversation just yet in terms of a budget and fiscal strategy. And even at the local level, we need to see a shift in our eating patterns, which is primarily and still driven by an import culture.
Right. Now, I know you've touched on it, but would you care to talk to us about what are some of the specific challenges faced by Kenya in achieving sustainable food systems, of course, in the face of climate change?
I think the fundamental one for me is the frame with which we actually define the value chain. When we look at what we eat and what we produce, you will find that there are bottlenecks within the value chain in a manner that demonstrates that food that is grown, for example, in the coastal agroecological zones is expensive, and not even just expensive, but would struggle to get to the western part, and what is available in the western part will not be able to get to the northeastern part. And so it's a function of a number of things. One, it's infrastructure. Two, the actual cost of getting food from one point to the other. And three is ultimately, again, this subject around climate, where because ecosystems and microcosms of those ecosystems are reliant on grain-fed agriculture, it then becomes a challenge when climate conditions change.
Right. And so when you say that, then you've got to ask yourself, if you're a local farmer or somebody who's part of this value chain, as we call it, somebody is asking themselves, what can we do? What practices can we adapt to be able to enhance our own resilience against climate impacts, specifically for Kenya? What would you say to such a person?
It's not as simple as the question sounds. And yet, at the end of the day, it also is as straightforward as first ensuring that what we have is not just food security, but what we have is food nutrition. So we can't, and unfortunately this sounds like a cop-out, but we can't have what I would call a Kenya-wide strategy. What we need to go back to is, and literally dive into, is what our constitution ultimately is, a devolved constituency, a devolved constitution. So we need to identify constituencies at the ward level. And I think primarily if we can begin to start looking at ecosystems at the ward level, begin to start measuring trends, providing the necessary input infrastructure, providing the necessary support structure, it will turn around. Unfortunately, I said it's not as simple as the flip of a switch, but I think my own assessment is that we need to devolve the decision making for the farmers. County governments need to step to the front. They were given the responsibility of agriculture. the conversation around costing of agriculture as a function requires extension services to be localized as a critical public service. Then the cost of food will begin to drop. But as long as food is having to travel across geographical spaces, cost is actually going to be an issue.
Right. I mean, so if we're talking about decentralizing or devolving this conversation and the decisions that need to be made, we're looking at quite a fair bit of partnership that needs to happen, a fair bit of collaboration. Would you care to talk to us what your opinion is on what partnerships between, say, government and private sector and civil societies are needed or are essential to foster climate-resilient agricultural practices in Kenya?
So I would start with the primary mover of production of food is the family. And I live in a town and a village in Kilifi that's called Zitsoni that sits within a sub-county. Now, what needs to happen is that sub-county needs to essentially carry out what has already been done, my brother, which is a mapping of the resources that are available. What is lacking, and I find in our villages, in our wards, and in our sub-county, is agency to work with what we have. There's a tendency in our country to attract what we would call, let me use the phrase, external direct investment, whether it's coming from across the country or whether it's coming from outside of the country, before we actually look at what we have around us. And I think primarily what needs to happen and the levels of partnership that we need to be looking for is you need to be looking for the local businessman. You need to be looking for the local teacher. You need to be looking for the local community mobilizer, the local community health worker. And agency needs to be found and partnership established at the local level. Once we have that, then data becomes the critical player. We cannot rely on external data to determine what should happen at a local level. The next thing that needs to happen, and this is currently happening with a bill that is before the Senate, which is the Ward Development Bill. The Ward Development Bill has established governance at the local level. The truth of the matter is, we as a people are a reflection of the leaders that we have, not just the politicians, even in our community organizations. And so what needs to happen is there needs to be an ownership by myself, recognizing that my family has a role within the community to partner with another family within the community and demystify this idea of what we call family at a productive level as nepotism. I think a lot of these words have been bastardized in that when we think of families working together, what are we expecting in an African setting? In the rural communities, historically, labor, workforce, entrepreneurship happened within the family. It is only with the external import of private sector models of small, medium, large enterprises that we're using that frame to determine what we call food production and food system. If we actually look inward, and we saw this happen across the time when we had COVID, the only challenge was that we hadn't mobilized enough resources and agency. So I think we're back, if you ask me, it's time to go back to the drawing board. It's time to play local, build that legacy from the, as it were, bottom up.
Right. If I may refer you to something you said a little bit earlier, and you said we need to take a step back. The people that came before us had the right idea. The communities have been resilient all along, and some of the practices that they used to survive, the harsh times when the climate would shift, have actually been tried and tested, and they're working. So let me take you back there, and so talk to us about how to marry that resilience, that institutional know-how, that almost the stories that are handed over from generation to generation. How do we marry that and investment or in technology or innovation and support of the same to be able to make this a reality and to actually take us to a good place? How do we do that?
Leadership from a cultural and intangible heritage perspective. I tell you, one of the things that for me is provoking and has been mind-boggling for me. And let me start at the national level and work my way down. My brother, we currently don't have a cabinet secretary for the position of gender, arts, and culture. That's a travesty. And the reason it's a travesty is because gender and culture are the drivers of any lifestyle, and particularly food production. Now, what we also need to be doing is take a really good look at who are the engine of food production in this country. It's our sisters, it's our mothers, it's our wives within our local community. Kenya is still at the point where 30%, maybe close to 40%, if we give it a little bit of advantage, are based in the urban areas. 60% of us are still out in what I would call our productive agro and marine and water ecological systems, which essentially means that our culture and our heritage is actually at the center of infrastructure design, at the center of investment. And if from the county government we're not prioritizing the departments of culture and gender and literally submitting them to token positions that are reduced to dancing entertainment, and not that there's anything wrong with the entertainment side of our culture, but ultimately, if we have culture and intangible heritage as the driver of food production, a lot of what you alluded to would actually literally have a domino effect in a very short time. So it's, for me, putting what I would call the crucible of our intangible heritage and culture and gender. It's time to actually provide our mothers, our sisters with an aspect of, not even an aspect, but a full aspect of inheritance, and not the 50-50% balance that we have that is either given because you've married and the law now says it's 50-50. We need to see fathers, we need to see mothers providing their daughters, their sisters with an inheritance. That's just an example of how I think things will begin to change. We will empower the very core of what is our culture and intangible heritage.
Right. And speaking of leadership, you, maybe for the Kenyans who are watching, Mr. Mtana actually, he vied for governor in Mombasa, and he ended up serving as Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries, the Blue Economy, and livestock development, of course, for the county of Mombasa. Talk to us about what you saw from the inside about the impact of leadership on the ground, specifically how it can affect not just the policies, but even the practices on the ground that can be able to transform a people and transform a problem like this to something else.
One of the most fulfilling moments of my time in government was having to appreciate that Mombasa, like the other 4 coastal counties that are waterfront counties, had finally got the opportunity to unlock the blue economy. And the realization that in independent history, we'd never actually begun to design and craft a blue economy was humbling, brought tears, required heavy lifting in terms of community engagement, and we thank the government, the national government of Kenya, for having negotiated a financial agreement with the World Bank to establish what is currently known as the Kenya Marine Fisheries Socio-Economic Development Project. That project, my brother, is a game changer. That project is now in year 2.5. Because of the nature of and the complexity of the negotiations between the largest financier, which is the World Bank, and the bureaucracy around that, the project is not implementing as fast as I think it should be. But for me, you asked me what was it like from the inside? It was like being a pioneer leader who, looking back at my grandfather, who was a wine tapper of coconut trees, mnazi, as a local drink that educated my father, that gave me the opportunity then to go to school like many others. And whether you think of cashew nut, whether you think of taffy, whether you think of changu, whether you think of tewa, which is fish in the ocean, and all those species, we had never in independent history crafted economies for our local community. I was sad that all I had was 2 years, but I believe that when we actually recognize that the agency that exists with county governments is possible, it's an opportunity to serve, and I hope and I wish and I continue to, even outside of and my time as a CEC member in Mombasa, having not made it as governor, but having had the opportunity to serve my people in an economy that has not even been unpacked in Kenya yet.
Right, thank you so much. Before I let you go, I want you to speak from your heart to the people of Kenya. Any message concerning the subject matter, anything that is in your heart to share, here is your opportunity. The mic and the camera are yours. Take it over, Mr. Mtana.
Our mothers and our sisters and our daughters need an inheritance. We need to recognize that across this great country of ours, they have been at the forefront of the production of food. We as a Kenyan and as a Kenyan community appreciate the heritage of splendor that we have. What we need to do is put heritage at the very core. Mr. President, I'm not sure whether you will hear me or hear this or watch this. You have a golden chance to turn around the economy of this country in finding an individual in whom the spirit of our constitution that recognizes the God of all creation as the primary producer of what we eat in our food system. Give us a CS who understands the intricacies of how to engender the most powerful and productive workforce in this country, our women, who understands the power of our culture and our heritage and can turn it into an art.
Right.
Because food production by the British has been described as agriculture. It needs to be a culture, production.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Tendai Lewa Mtana, who is a former CEC member for Agriculture, Livestock Development and the Blue Economy of the County of Mombasa, but currently serves as a chief strategist at Kaya Advisory. We have been talking about sustainable and climate resilient food systems in Kenya. My name is Victor Muyakane. This has been Inside Tonight, and I hope you've got some of that. Good night and God bless you.